The storm had not yet broken when Thomas Avery saw her. A young woman collapsing on the mountain trail, rain soaking the secret she carried beneath her trembling hands. He thought she was a stranger, but fate had other plans. In a single night, two lives scarred by silence would collide beneath thunder and firelight. A wounded man haunted by loss, and a pregnant woman fleeing a name too powerful to speak. As the mountains roared, one act of mercy would awaken a love strong enough to defy shame, fear, and the world itself. If you love emotional historical romances like this one, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so together we can keep these stories alive. Pine Ridge, Montana, 1891. The mountains loomed vast and silent beneath the gray sky, their peaks shrouded in mist and the smell of pine heavy in the air. The wind carried the bite of oncoming winter, bending the tall grass along the trail and whispering through the pines like a warning. Thomas Avery rode slowly, his hat pulled low against the rain that had begun to fall in thin, needling sheets. He had spent the day repairing a fence along the ridge, and every part of him, boots, coat, and soul, was soaked through. He had learned long ago that solitude did not ask questions, nor offer comfort. It was simply what a man deserved when he had nothing left to give. By the time he reached the narrow pass that curved toward his cabin, the rain had thickened into a cold torrent. Then, between the flashes of lightning, he saw movement on the trail ahead. A small, hunched figure struggling through the mud. At first, he thought it might be a lost traveler, or perhaps a runaway horse hand, but as he drew closer, the shape collapsed onto the ground, motionless. Thomas jumped from his horse, his boots sinking into the slick earth. He crouched beside the figure and found a young woman, her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn and clinging to her body. She was trembling violently, her lips pale and her hands clutching the bundle of her cloak over her stomach. When he pulled it back, realization struck him like a blow. She was with child, far along and clearly exhausted. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice low, steady, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "You're safe now. You hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Please, don't take me back," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the rain. "I'm not taking you anywhere but out of this storm." He lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light for her condition. The faint sound of her breathing trembled against his chest as he carried her to his horse and secured her carefully across the saddle. The ride back to his cabin felt endless. The rain stung his face, the wind howled through the trees, and every few moments he looked down to make sure she was still breathing. When he finally reached the small wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the ridge, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The warmth from the hearth greeted them like a forgotten memory. Thomas laid her on the bed near the fire and quickly removed her soaked cloak. Her skin was cold as snow. He took one of his wool blankets from the chest and wrapped it tightly around her. For a moment he simply watched her, the lamplight flickering across her fragile face. When she stirred, she tried to rise. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice sharp despite her weakness. "In my cabin," he said quietly. "You were half dead on the trail. Rest now." She blinked, her eyes darting around the simple room, rough-hewn furniture, a wooden table, the faint smell of pine resin and tobacco. "I can't stay here," she murmured. "They'll come for me." "Who?" She pressed her lips together, refusing to answer. Her chin trembled, but she held herself with a kind of desperate dignity that made Thomas's chest tighten. "Whoever they are," he said, his tone firm, "they'll have to get through the mountain first. You're safe tonight." "I don't even know your name." "Thomas Avery," he replied. "And you?" She hesitated before answering, as if the name itself might bring trouble upon her. Eleanor Finch." The fire cracked, filling the silence between them. Thomas nodded once. "All right, Miss Finch, you rest. I'll keep the fire going." She turned her face away, but he saw tears gather on her lashes. He pretended not to notice. moving to hang her wet cloak by the fire. The fabric steamed as it dried, and her faint sobs mingled with the sound of the rain on the roof. When he brought her a bowl of broth and set it near the bed, she looked up, eyes wide with suspicion. "You're kind to a stranger," she said, almost accusingly. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You looked like someone who needed kindness." For a moment, something shifted between them, a fragile understanding neither had asked for. She lowered her eyes to the bowl and whispered, "I used to believe people like you didn't exist anymore." Thomas leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. "People like me? People who help without wanting something in return." His throat tightened. "I'm no hero, Miss Finch. Just a man who didn't want to find a grave on his doorstep come morning." Her lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. "Even so, thank you." The storm raged through the night. Thomas dozed lightly in a chair by the fire, his rifle propped within reach. Once, near dawn, Eleanor cried out in her sleep. He rose and stood beside her, unsure whether to wake her. Her face was pale in the flickering light, her hand resting protectively over her belly. He reached out, hesitated, then gently covered her hand with his. Her trembling eased almost at once, and her breathing steadied. He withdrew his hand quickly, as though afraid she might feel the warmth that had flooded his chest. Outside, the wind began to quiet. The cabin seemed smaller now, the fire softer, the air filled with a stillness that was not peace, but the fragile calm after chaos. Thomas looked at the sleeping woman, her face lit by the fire, her hair a dark halo against the pillow, and wondered what storm she had brought with her besides the one that had soaked the mountains. He did not yet know that the moment he found her in the rain, his life had changed forever. For now, there was only the faint sound of rain easing into silence and the steady beat of her fragile breathing in the quiet heart of the mountain. Morning crept slowly over the Bitterroot Mountains, pale and fragile after the fury of the night before. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth soaked and shining beneath a thin veil of mist. Inside the small cabin, the air smelled of smoke, damp wool, and something unfamiliar. Hope, perhaps, though neither of them would have dared to name it. Thomas Avery stood at the hearth, stirring the embers back to life. His movements were quiet, practiced, the gestures of a man who had learned to keep company with silence. He poured water into the iron pot and added the last of the oats. Behind him, the faint rustle of blankets drew his attention. Eleanor Finch was awake. She lay very still at first, her eyes open and unblinking, as if the simple act of waking in a strange bed demanded courage. The firelight brushed the edge of her face, tracing the hollow beneath her cheekbone and the curve of her lips. For a moment, she looked almost peaceful, but then awareness returned, and her body tensed. "Good morning," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. Eleanor pushed herself up slowly, her hands trembling against the quilt. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night. You slept near 12 hours straight." Her brow furrowed. "I should go." Thomas turned the spoon in the pot without looking at her. "You're in no condition to ride anywhere. Roads are half washed away. I can walk." He faced her then, and the quiet firmness in his gaze stopped her protest. "You can't." Their eyes met, hers bright with defiance, his steady with something deeper than authority. It was not command, but concern, the kind that unsettled her more than anger ever could. Eleanor looked away first, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "I don't even know you," she murmured. "Then let that be your reason to rest," he replied simply. "I've no cause to harm you, Miss Finch. There's food when you're ready." He placed a small bowl of porridge and a tin cup of tea on the table near the bed. She hesitated, as if accepting kindness were more dangerous than the storm itself. Her pride warred with hunger until finally she reached for the spoon, her movements slow, cautious. Thomas turned back to the window. The mist outside clung to the trees, ghost-like. He listened to the faint sound of her eating, the soft scrape of metal against wood, the quiet breaths between each bite, and something stirred in him, something he had not felt in years. The presence of another life within these walls changed everything, the rhythm of his breath, the sound of his own thoughts. When she finished, she said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded, without turning around. "You're welcome." For a time there was only the whisper of wind through the logs and the steady crackle of the fire. Eleanor's gaze roamed the cabin. A narrow cot, a sturdy table, a shelf of worn books, and a row of tools lined neatly by the door. Everything was simple, useful, untouched by vanity. Yet the place felt safe, built by a man who cared enough to mend what was broken and keep what he loved alive. "Do you live here alone?" she asked. "Yes, always, since my wife passed." The words came flatly, as if carved from stone, but the silence that followed told her it still hurt. She looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry." He shrugged one shoulder. "No need to be." But the slight tightening around his jaw betrayed him. Eleanor recognized grief when she saw it. It was written in the way he held himself, as if the very air might shatter him if he breathed too deeply. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked softly. Thomas paused, considering the question. Lonely and alone aren't always the same thing. Eleanor's lips parted, as though she wanted to ask more, but she bit the words back. The truth was, she understood perfectly. She had spent months surrounded by people who called themselves family, and had never felt more forsaken. He gestured to the chair near the fire. "You can sit there a while. The heat will help your strength." She rose carefully, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. The sight made something twist inside him, an ache he couldn't name. He fetched one of his wool shirts and offered it to her. "You're still damp," he said. "Put this on. It's clean." She looked at the garment, then at him. "You want me to wear your clothes?" He gave a faint smile, more out of awkwardness than humor. "They're warm. That's all that matters up here." Her cheeks flushed, but she accepted. "Turn around, please." He did, standing by the window as she changed. The faint rustle of fabric behind him filled the cabin with a strange tension. Quiet, intimate, dangerous in its simplicity. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "All right." Thomas turned. She looked smaller in his shirt, the sleeves rolled up over her wrists, the hem brushing her knees. Her hair, still damp from the night before, framed her face in loose waves. The firelight painted her skin with gold. For the first time, he saw not the frightened runaway from the storm, but the woman she truly was, young, proud, and burdened by a strength she could barely sustain. "You'll need to rest a few days," he said. "The road down's treacherous till the ground dries." "I don't intend to stay that long," she answered. "Intending won't change the weather." She sighed, folding her arms. "You don't understand. If they find me here, you could be in danger." "Danger doesn't scare me much anymore." Something in his tone silenced her. He didn't say it as a boast, but as a fact born of loss, the kind of courage that no longer sought meaning, only endurance. Eleanor studied him, puzzled. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Avery? You don't know who I am. For all you know, I could be—" He cut her off gently. "You're someone who needed help. That's enough." Her eyes softened, but she quickly looked away. "You'll regret it." "Maybe," he said, "but not today." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Thomas mended a chair leg by the hearth, while Eleanor dozed in the rocker, her hands resting protectively on her belly. Every so often, she would startle awake, as if chased by dreams. Once, when she gasped, Thomas rose instinctively. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just the sound of thunder in my head." He nodded, but the faint crease between his brows remained. "You'll get used to the silence here. It's louder than it looks." By afternoon, the mist began to lift. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the trees, turning the wet world into 1,000 glimmers. Eleanor stood near the door, watching steam rise from the ground. The mountains stretched endlessly, wild and uncontained. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," Thomas agreed, "but it can turn cruel in a breath." She glanced at him. "Like people, then?" He met her eyes. Sometimes. Their gazes held longer than either expected. The air between them seemed to hum, fragile and electric. She looked away first, pretending to study the mountains again. That evening he prepared stew while she folded her cloak by the fire. The domestic quiet felt almost unnatural, as if the world outside had stopped to watch them. When he served her a bowl, she smiled faintly. "You cook," she said, surprised. He shrugged. "A man learns, or he starves. You don't seem the starving kind." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "No, I suppose not anymore." Eleanor stirred the stew, her appetite gone despite its warmth. "Before the storm," she said quietly, "I thought I might die out there. Part of me hoped I would. It would have been easier." Thomas froze, the spoon in his hand hovering above his own bowl. "Don't say that. It's true," she whispered. "When you've lost everything, family, name, respect, death doesn't seem cruel anymore." He leaned forward, his voice low. "You haven't lost everything." She looked at him sharply. "What else is there?" "Yourself," he said, "and the child you're carrying." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected tenderness from him, and it struck deeper than pity. "You speak as if you know what it's like to lose everything." "I do." For a long time they said nothing. The fire popped softly, sending shadows dancing along the walls. Finally she whispered, "Was she beautiful, your wife?" Thomas's eyes drifted to the flames. "Yes, and kind. She died before winter ended. Fever took her quick. I buried her in the valley below." Eleanor's heart tightened. "I'm sorry. She would have wanted me to help you," he said quietly. "She never could turn away from someone in trouble." Eleanor blinked back tears she hadn't meant to shed. "Then perhaps she's the reason I found you." The simplicity of the words hit him like a blow. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a stranger, but something his life had been missing without him knowing. "Eat your supper," he said softly, almost to himself. When night fell, the wind outside had turned gentle, the sky clear enough to see a sliver of moon through the small window. Eleanor wrapped herself in the quilt while Thomas sat near the door, carving a piece of wood into something shapeless just to keep his hands busy. She watched him for a while before speaking. "You don't sleep much, do you?" "Not when there's thinking to do." "About what?" "About why a woman like you was walking through the mountains alone in the dead of night." Eleanor hesitated. "I had nowhere else to go." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give," she said softly. Thomas set the carving aside. "Then I won't press you. But you should know this cabin is no prison. You can leave whenever you're ready." Her eyes met his, dark and uncertain. "And if I'm never ready?" He held her gaze, the firelight flickering between them. "Then you'll stay until you are." Silence settled again, heavy and tender. The air seemed to pulse with something unspoken, something neither dared to name. Outside, the mountains stood guard, the night calm and endless. Inside, two souls who had forgotten how to trust found themselves caught in a stillness that felt dangerously close to peace. Thomas turned toward the dying fire, his expression unreadable, and Eleanor lay back beneath the quilt, her hand resting on her heart. Neither of them knew how much the world would change when morning came, but for that night they existed in fragile harmony, the widower and the runaway, bound not by circumstance, but by the quiet miracle of being found when neither believed it possible. The morning light came slow and silver, slipping through the pine branches and settling on the cabin walls like a hesitant visitor. A pale mist curled across the valley, softening the world until it looked almost merciful. Inside, the fire had burned low, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the sweetness of freshly baked bread. Thomas Avery stood by the hearth, his sleeves rolled up, cutting slices with deliberate care. Eleanor Finch sat nearby, mending one of his shirts. The small rhythmic motion of her hands filled the silence, the needle flashing each time it caught the light. Her hair was tied back loosely, and a single strand had escaped, brushing against her cheek. She did not notice it until Thomas's voice broke the quiet. "You're good at that," he said. She smiled faintly, eyes still on her work. I was taught to sew before I could read. In my world, a woman's worth was measured by how neat her stitches were. Seems to me you've been measured unfairly, he murmured. Eleanor's hands paused. She lifted her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. You don't know my world, Mr. Avery. He nodded once. No, I suppose I don't. But I know what it means to live under someone else's judgment. Her lips parted, but she did not answer. The air between them grew charged, the silence full of things neither dared to name. When she finished sewing, she folded the shirt carefully and placed it on the table. It's strange, she said softly. Being here feels like stepping outside of time. The world out there, what it expects of me, feels so far away. Thomas looked at her with quiet intensity. Maybe that's what you need. Distance. And you? She asked. Is that why you live up here, because distance feels safer than people? His eyes shifted toward the window. People break things they don't understand. Her voice softened. Like hearts? He turned back to her, a hint of something unspoken flickering across his face. Like peace, he said finally. They shared a long look, one that neither broke until the sound of hooves shattered the morning calm. Thomas moved first, setting down his knife and striding toward the window. Two riders were approaching along the muddy trail, their silhouettes sharp against the fog. Stay here, he said quietly. Who is it? Don't know, but they're dressed for town. Eleanor's pulse quickened. You think they're looking for me? I think I'd rather not find out just yet. Thomas took his rifle from its place by the door and stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him. The riders slowed as they reached the clearing, a pair of men with tidy coats, too fine for the mountain. Their horses were sleek and restless, their eyes cold with calculation. Morning, Thomas called, his tone casual but guarded. The taller man tipped his hat. Morning to you. Fine place you have here. Didn't expect to find a cabin this far up. Most don't. The man smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. Name's Hartwell Sloane. My companion's Edmund Rourke. We're looking for a lady who might have lost her way. She's in delicate condition, and her family's mighty worried. Thomas's jaw tightened. No one's come through here. Hartwell's gaze swept the cabin behind him. You live alone, then? That's right. Strange, the man said, still smiling. We were told someone saw smoke from this direction late last night. Big fire. You expecting company? Thomas met his gaze without flinching. The weather's been cold. I keep the fire high. Nothing strange about that. The men exchanged a glance, then Hartwell shrugged. If you happen to see anyone, especially a young lady traveling alone, you let the sheriff know. Would be a shame if something happened to her in these woods. I'll remember that. They turned their horses, but Thomas didn't move until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he lower his rifle and let out the breath he'd been holding. When he stepped back inside, Eleanor was standing near the door, pale and wide-eyed. They were asking about me, weren't they? She whispered. They didn't have your name, but I'd bet my life they're from your family. Her hand went to her chest. They won't stop. They never do. Then we'll be careful, he said. You should have told them I was here, she said suddenly, her voice shaking. If they find out you lied, they'll think you're helping me. I am helping you. She turned toward him, eyes shining with fear. You don't understand what they can do. I don't need to, he replied quietly. You needed a place to be safe. You have it. Eleanor's breath trembled as she spoke. You'll ruin yourself. He took a slow step closer. I've been ruined before, Miss Finch. It's not as terrible as people make it sound. The words silenced her. For a long moment, she could only stare at him, searching for a trace of hesitation. There was none. His calm, his certainty, his strength, it all disarmed her more than the storm ever had. Later that afternoon, Thomas saddled his horse and prepared to ride down to Pine Ridge. He needed supplies, and to listen. Rumors, he knew, moved faster than truth. Eleanor watched him from the doorway, her hands clasped over her stomach. Be careful, she said. I always am. I mean it, Thomas. Her use of his name made him pause. It was the first time she had said it aloud. The sound of it in her voice did something to him, something he could neither control nor deny. He looked at her, eyes warm beneath the brim of his hat. I'll come back before nightfall, he said softly. Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone but me. She nodded, though worry lingered in her gaze. The ride to town was long, and the path slick with mud. By the time he reached Pine Ridge, the streets were already alive with whispers. He stopped at the general store, and the moment he entered, the conversation inside faltered. Morning, Mr. Avery, the shopkeeper said too quickly. Need anything today? Flour, sugar, ammunition, Thomas replied. As the man gathered the items, two women standing by the fabric counter whispered behind gloved hands. They say a woman's gone missing, one murmured. A lady from back east, expecting a child, poor thing. I heard she ran away with a man, said the other. Shameful, really. Thomas pretended not to hear, but every word landed like a stone. When he paid for his goods, the shopkeeper hesitated. Sheriff McCrae's been asking if anyone's seen strangers around. You been keeping to yourself up there? As always, Thomas said evenly. Storm kept me busy. Well, you watch yourself. Seems her family's sending men to search every cabin in the foothills. Thomas tipped his hat and left. As he rode back through the forest, his mind churned. He had never cared much for gossip. It was the one crop that grew without rain, but this time it could destroy the fragile peace he'd built. By the time he reached the clearing, dusk had settled. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he felt a strange comfort at the sight. Inside, Eleanor was sitting near the fire, mending again. She looked up as he entered, relief washing over her face. You came back, she said softly. I said I would. He set down the supplies and studied her for a moment. You kept the fire well. She smiled faintly. It made me feel less alone. He knelt to stir the coals, and she watched the way his hands moved, steady, sure, capable of gentleness despite their roughness. Something in her chest tightened. What did you hear in town? She asked. He hesitated. Enough to know they're looking for you. She closed her eyes briefly. Then it's only a matter of time. He rose and turned to face her. Not if you trust me. Her breath caught. Trust is a dangerous thing, Mr. Avery. So is running, he said. But you've done that already. She looked at him for a long time, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. Why do you care what happens to me? Thomas took a slow breath, his voice quiet but steady. Because I know what it means to lose everything and still want to live. The word struck her like a confession. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, he admitted. But it's possible. The fire crackled softly. The air between them grew warm, charged with an invisible current. She shifted closer to the fire, her hands trembling as she reached for her cup of tea. Thomas moved beside her to add another log, and their fingers brushed for the briefest instant. The contact sent a shock through both of them, small, forbidden, too human to ignore. Eleanor withdrew her hand quickly, her cheeks flushed. You shouldn't be kind to me, she whispered. I don't deserve it. He looked at her then, his gaze unwavering. Kindness isn't something you earn, Eleanor. It's something you give. The sound of her name in his voice nearly undid her. No one had spoken it like that in months, without accusation, without ownership, simply as though it belonged to her again. She turned away, blinking back tears. You make it very hard to keep my walls up. Then maybe you don't need them. She gave a broken laugh. If you knew who I really was, you'd think differently. Maybe, he said softly. But until you tell me, I'll think what I see. A woman with courage enough to survive a storm. Their eyes met once more, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with everything unspoken, the longing, the fear, the slow, dangerous warmth of two souls finding one another in the dark. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying faint echoes of voices from the valley below. The world was already beginning to turn against them, though they did not yet know how far those whispers would reach. Inside the cabin, however, time stood still. Thomas watched Eleanor as she smoothed the fabric in her lap, her lashes still wet, her lips trembling with words she dared not say. He wanted to tell her that she was safe, that she was no longer alone, but he knew safety was a promise a man like him could never make. So instead, he said only, "You should rest. Tomorrow we'll think of what comes next." Eleanor nodded, though her gaze lingered on him longer than she intended. "Good night, Thomas." He felt the words settle deep within him, heavier than he expected. "Good night, Eleanor." As she lay down, the fire's glow painted the room in amber light. Thomas sat in his chair, listening to the sound of the wind against the walls. The mountain, vast and indifferent, stood guard around them, but inside that small cabin, something fragile and miraculous had begun to take root, something neither law nor rumor could yet destroy. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. The silence they shared was no longer loneliness, it was the first heartbeat of something that could change everything. The next morning dawned heavy with grey clouds and a chill that crept through the pines like an omen. The mountains stood solemn and silent, their peaks veiled in mist. Inside the small cabin, the fire crackled weakly as Thomas placed more wood on the hearth. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea gone cold. Though the warmth of the fire reached her, her heart refused to thaw. She had barely slept. The memory of the two riders haunted her, those polished boots, those deliberate smiles, that polite cruelty hidden beneath civility. She could still hear the way one of them had said, "A lady who might have lost her way," as though she were nothing more than a lost object to be retrieved. Thomas moved quietly, pouring hot water into her cup. "You need to keep your strength," he said softly. She looked up at him, her voice fragile. "Strength for what? For whatever comes." Her lips trembled. "They'll come back, won't they?" He met her gaze, his eyes calm but resolute. "Yes, and when they do, you'll let me speak to them." She wanted to protest, to tell him that no man could stop what was already set in motion, but the steadiness in his voice silenced her. There was something in his eyes, something unwavering, that gave her a strange, fleeting comfort. When the sound of hooves broke the stillness, her breath caught in her throat. Thomas's expression hardened, and he stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," he said firmly. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table. "Please, don't let them hurt you." He gave her a faint, reassuring smile. "They won't." The knock came, sharp and deliberate. Thomas opened the door, his large frame filling the doorway. Outside stood the same two men from before, Hartwell Sloane and Edmund Rourke. Their horses stamped impatiently behind them, and the damp smell of the trail clung to their fine coats. "Mr. Avery," Hartwell greeted, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "I told you we'd be back. Hope we're not intruding on your morning." "Depends on your purpose," Thomas replied evenly. "Our purpose is simple," Hartwell said, smiling thinly. "We're here to collect someone who doesn't belong here." "You're mistaken. There's no one here but me." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I do mind." Hartwell chuckled softly. Now. You wouldn't want to be accused of obstructing justice, would you? The lady in question is in trouble. She needs to be returned to her family." Thomas's grip on the door tightened. "If she needed her family, she wouldn't have left." Hartwell's smile faltered, revealing the sharp edge beneath his manners. "You've got a way of talking that could get a man into trouble, Mr. Avery. I've been in trouble before." The silence stretched taut between them. Then, from behind Thomas, Eleanor's voice broke through. "Enough." She stepped into view, her face pale but determined. The men's eyes widened slightly as they recognized her. Hartwell removed his hat, his expression shifting from surprise to satisfaction. "Miss Finch," he said smoothly, "you've given your family quite the scare. They've been frantic. Come with us, and we'll see that you're taken care of properly." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Properly? You mean hidden, controlled, shamed?" Your situation, Miss Finch, requires discretion, Hartwell replied. Surely you understand that. Her eyes flashed. Discretion for whom? For me, or for the man who ruined me? Rourke shifted uncomfortably, but Hartwell's tone remained cool. It doesn't matter who's at fault. What matters is that you come home. You'll have everything you need. Comfort, safety. Prison walls wrapped in lace, she interrupted bitterly. No, thank you. Thomas stood silent beside her, his presence alone enough to make both men uneasy. The firelight from inside caught the rough edges of his face, and in that moment he looked every bit the man capable of defending what he loved, even at the cost of everything else. Hartwell glanced between them, his smile returning, more condescending this time. I see how it is. You found yourself a protector. Eleanor's voice wavered but did not break. He's the first man who's treated me as something other than property. Rourke sneered. You call this living? In a shack on a mountain? I call it freedom, she said quietly. Hartwell sighed, the false civility slipping. Miss Finch, you are not in a position to choose. Your family insists on your return. If you resist, I'll have no choice but to involve the sheriff. It'll go easier if you cooperate. Thomas's voice came low, controlled. She's not leaving this cabin against her will. Hartwell looked up at him, studying the man who dared to defy him. Be careful, Mr. Avery. You wouldn't want the good people of Pine Ridge thinking you've abducted a lady in her condition. Thomas didn't move. They can think what they want. I know the truth. For the first time, Hartwell's composure cracked. His smile vanished, and his eyes hardened. You've made a mistake, he said coldly. We'll be back. With the law. Eleanor's voice rang out before they could turn away. Do what you must. But know this, I will not go back. Hartwell's gaze lingered on her for a long, assessing moment. Then he tipped his hat once more. You always were a stubborn girl. That hasn't changed. They mounted their horses and rode off, their figures disappearing into the trees. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Eleanor exhale, her knees threatening to give way. Thomas closed the door gently and turned to her. You shouldn't have come out. I couldn't hide like a coward, she said, her voice trembling. They would have known I was here anyway. He stepped closer, his expression softening. You were brave. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. No, just tired of being afraid. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Thomas reached out slowly, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was simple, but it burned with tenderness. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he murmured. Her breath caught, and she closed her eyes. Don't make promises you can't keep. Then let me try to keep them, he said. She opened her eyes, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Something fragile, beautiful, and terrifying. The rest of the day passed in a tense quiet. Thomas busied himself chopping wood, though his thoughts stayed fixed on what had happened. He knew the men would return. He knew they would not come alone. But every time he looked toward the cabin window and saw Eleanor's shadow moving behind the glass, his resolve hardened. Inside, Eleanor sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The conversation replayed in her mind like an echo that refused to fade. Property. That word. How many times had she heard it whispered behind her back, printed in letters, spoken by the men who claimed to know what was best for her? When Thomas entered later, covered in sawdust and exhaustion, she rose to meet him. You shouldn't have stood up to them, she said. They'll make you pay for it. He set down his axe. Let them try. You don't understand, she insisted. My family. I don't care who they are, he interrupted quietly. No one has the right to take you against your will. Her voice trembled. You're risking everything for me. He looked at her then, and the warmth in his gaze stole her breath. It's not a risk, if it's what I want to do. She blinked back sudden tears. You don't even know me. Maybe not, he said, but I know what I see. A woman worth fighting for. Her heart fluttered painfully. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? Because I might believe you, she whispered. Thomas's hand found hers before either could think better of it. The contact was light, tentative but electric. He felt the delicate tremor of her fingers, the warmth of her skin. "Then believe me," he said softly. "You've lived too long in fear. Let someone else carry some of it for a while." Her lips parted, but no words came. The fire cast their shadows long and golden against the wall, two figures caught between duty and desire. The world outside could have ended, and neither would have noticed. After a moment, she pulled her hand back, her eyes glistening with emotion she couldn't contain. "If they return, I'll go with them," she said suddenly. Thomas's jaw tightened. "You don't mean that. I won't let you lose everything because of me." "Eleanor!" "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You've already done enough. I can't let my past destroy what little peace you have left." He stepped closer, his voice low and rough. "You think peace is all I want. I buried peace years ago right next to my wife. What I want now is something worth standing for again. And I've found it." Her eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say that." "It's the truth." For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then, without thinking, Eleanor reached out and pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. "You shouldn't waste your heart on someone broken," she said softly. He covered her hand with his own, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Maybe broken things fit better together." The fire crackled behind them, filling the silence with its soft song. When she finally withdrew her hand, her cheeks were flushed, her breath unsteady. Thomas turned away before he could say more. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We'll face whatever comes when it comes." She nodded, though sleep would not come easily that night. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the echo of hooves fading into the distance, a reminder that the peace inside the cabin was only borrowed, fragile as glass. But as Eleanor lay beneath the quilt, her hand resting over her heart, she felt something new stirring beneath the fear. It was small, uncertain, but alive. Hope, perhaps, or something perilously close to love. The snow came early that year, drifting softly through the pines and blanketing the world in silence. The first flakes fell as the day faded, and by the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the cabin was wrapped in a white hush that muffled every sound. Inside, the fire glowed deep and orange, painting the wooden walls in shades of warmth that defied the cold beyond. Eleanor Finch stood near the hearth, her hands resting lightly on her rounded belly. The baby stirred beneath her touch, a quiet reminder that life persisted even in exile. She watched Thomas move about the room, his gestures measured, his voice steady whenever he spoke, though she could sense a storm behind his composure. He was a man accustomed to hardship, yet something about the presence of a woman, her of all people, seemed to unsettle him in ways he did not show. "I thought winter wouldn't come for another month," she said, her voice breaking the silence. Thomas looked toward the window, where the snow pressed gently against the glass. "It comes when it pleases," he replied. "The mountains don't wait for anyone." She smiled faintly. "You talk about them as if they're alive." "They are," he said simply. "You learn to listen long enough. They tell you what kind of man you are." Eleanor tilted her head. "And what have they told you, Mr. Avery?" He paused, turning the poker in the fire. "That I'm a man who stopped listening for too long." The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable, but full of a tenderness that neither dared to name. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, warmth and unspoken words filled the space between them. Later, after supper, Thomas brought a small oil lamp to the table and set it beside a worn, leather-bound book. Its edges were frayed, the pages yellowed. "What is that?" Eleanor asked, curiosity flickering in her tone. "My wife's old Bible," he said. "She used to read it aloud every night. I kept it for the words more than the faith." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Did you read to her too?" He gave a small, almost embarrassed shake of his head. "Never learned properly. My father didn't think books were worth a day's work." "Would you like to learn?" she asked gently. He glanced up, surprised. "At my age?" "At any age," she replied, smiling. "There's no harm in learning to read the words you kept for love's sake." For a moment he said nothing. Then he pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat down. "All right, teach me." Eleanor opened the book carefully, her fingers tracing the faded letters. The lamplight fell across her face, turning her eyes a soft gold. "We'll start with something simple," she said. "Read the first line." He squinted at the page. "In the beginning," she corrected softly, her tone more tender than instructive. "Try again." "In the beginning." He stopped, his brows furrowing as his voice grew quiet. She leaned closer. "You're doing fine." Their shoulders nearly touched. The scent of her hair, soap and pine smoke, mingled with the warmth of the fire. His pulse quickened at the closeness, though he kept his gaze fixed on the page. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes. "Because you helped me first." Something flickered in his chest, something both dangerous and beautiful. He cleared his throat and looked back to the book. "Go on," he murmured. For the next hour, they read together, stumbling over words, laughing softly when he mispronounced them, pausing when her breath caught from the baby's movements. It was not learning in the strict sense, but something deeper, an exchange of trust, of small, quiet companionship. When she finally closed the book, Thomas found himself unwilling to let the moment end. "You're a patient teacher," he said. She smiled. "You're a quick learner." "I doubt that. You just need someone to believe you can do it." Her words lingered in the air long after she spoke them. Thomas looked down at his hands, scarred and rough, the hands of a man who had built walls instead of dreams. "I don't remember the last time someone said they believed in me." Eleanor reached across the table and touched his wrist lightly. "Then let this be the first time again." The touch lasted only a breath, but it was enough to send warmth through him that no fire could match. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as the frightened woman who had arrived at his door, but as someone who carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you make this place feel less empty." Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "And you make it feel safe." He wanted to say more, to tell her what her presence meant, how the cabin had ceased to feel like a tomb since she arrived. But the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he rose and moved toward the hearth, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "You should rest. I'll bank the fire." She nodded, though her gaze lingered on him, tracing the lines of his face, the way the firelight caught the edges of his hair. "Good night, Thomas." He hesitated, his back still turned. "Good night, Eleanor." She went to her small bed by the far wall, pulling the quilt around her. Yet long after she lay down, her eyes remained open, drawn to the sound of his steady movements, the soft scrape of a chair, the sigh of the fire. She listened to every sound as if each one might be the last thing that tethered her to peace. When the lamp finally dimmed, Thomas sat in his chair near the door, watching the glow fade. The cabin was quiet but alive, filled with a warmth that was not just from the fire. He looked toward the bed where she slept, her face turned slightly toward him, her hair spilling across the pillow. Without meaning to, he whispered into the darkness, "You don't belong to them anymore." He did not know if she heard him. The next morning the snow was deeper, soft drifts against the cabin walls. Thomas rose early and found Eleanor already awake, humming faintly as she kneaded dough on the table. She wore one of his flannel shirts again, the sleeves rolled up, her hair pinned loosely. For a moment, the sight of her like that, barefoot, content, at home, filled him with a quiet ache. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said, smiling shyly. "You didn't," he replied. "I'm just not used to hearing music in the mornings." She laughed softly. "I used to sing all the time. My mother said a house without song was a house without joy." "Seems your mother was right." Eleanor's expression dimmed for a moment. "She died when I was young. After that, there was little room for joy." Thomas nodded. "Maybe this place can hold a little for you now." She looked up at him, her eyes full of something that made his chest tighten. It already does. They ate together quietly, the kind of silence that felt like understanding rather than distance. When she reached for her cup, her hand brushed his, and neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact was fleeting but full of meaning, like a secret neither wanted to admit, but neither could deny. "Thomas," she said softly, "do you ever think about what it means to start over?" "All the time," he said, "but I never thought I'd get the chance." Her voice trembled slightly. "Maybe we both have." Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the pines. The sound was wild, almost mournful. Eleanor turned toward the window, her face caught between wonder and fear. "It's strange how quiet it can be here," she murmured. "It feels like the world forgot about us." "Let it," Thomas said. "The world never gave us much worth remembering." She smiled faintly. "You speak like a man who's made peace with solitude." "Not anymore," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Their eyes met again, and something fragile passed between them. A promise, unspoken but real. That evening, when the storm deepened and the light faded to amber, Eleanor sat by the table once more, with the book open in front of her. Thomas joined her without a word. This time she chose a passage about mercy. As he stumbled through the words, she corrected him gently, her tone tender, almost reverent. When he faltered, she smiled. "You're getting better, only because you're patient." She looked at him with quiet affection. "No, Thomas, because you're brave enough to try." The words settled between them, soft as snowfall. He felt her hand rest on the page beside his, her fingers barely touching his skin. Neither moved. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating every delicate feature, the curve of her lips, the shimmer in her eyes. "I don't know what will happen when spring comes," she said after a moment, her voice trembling slightly. "But right now, here, I feel something I thought I'd lost forever." He swallowed hard. "What's that?" "Peace." He reached out then, unable to stop himself, and brushed his thumb gently along her wrist. The gesture was chaste, but filled with emotion too deep to disguise. "Then we'll hold on to it as long as we can." For a long time they sat like that, the snow falling silently outside, while the lamplight flickered between them. Two souls bound by circumstance, by sorrow, and by something that neither could yet name, but both could feel growing stronger with every passing breath. When she finally rose to retire, her hand lingered on the back of his chair. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me back a piece of myself." He looked up at her, his voice low and full of quiet certainty. "You never lost it, Eleanor. You just needed someone to remind you where it was." She smiled then, a true smile, bright and trembling, and for the first time since the storm that had brought her to his door, she felt safe enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could begin again. That night, long after she had fallen asleep, Thomas sat by the fire, the Bible still open on the table, her small, graceful handwriting marking a passage she had shown him earlier. His fingers traced the words slowly, reverently. "Love is patient. Love is kind." He closed the book, his heart heavy and full all at once. The snow whispered against the window pane, and in that soft, sacred stillness, Thomas Avery realized that the woman sleeping in his cabin had already become the light by which he saw the world anew. The days grew shorter, and the mountains began to carry that sharp, quiet cold that promised a long winter. Snow dusted the pine branches, and frost clung to the windows each morning, turning the glass into delicate lace. Inside the cabin, a stillness had settled, comfortable, familiar, but fragile, like something that might shatter with a single word. Eleanor Finch sat by the small window, mending a tear in Thomas's coat. The needle moved steadily between her fingers, the soft rhythm calming her thoughts. She had begun to know the sounds of the mountain, as one learns a lover's voice, the distant howl of wolves, the groan of frozen wood, the sigh of wind slipping through the cracks in the roof. But there was a sound that did not belong to nature, one that had haunted her for days now, the echo of Hartwell Sloane's parting threat. "We'll be back. With the law." She tried to push it away, to focus on the comfort of the cabin, on the smell of smoke and bread and pine, but fear crept in quietly, like cold beneath the door. Thomas entered then, his presence filling the space as naturally as the fire filled the hearth. He brushed snow from his shoulders and hung his hat on the peg by the door. His face was red from the wind, his eyes thoughtful. "You went out early," Eleanor said, looking up from her sewing. "Down to the creek," he replied. "Check the traps. Nothing worth keeping." She nodded, her gaze falling to the coat again. "It's getting colder." "It'll keep," he said. "You should stay near the fire. No need to strain yourself." Her lips curved faintly. "You talk as if I were made of glass." He smiled, but his tone was serious. "You've been through enough storms, Eleanor. I just don't want another one finding you unprepared." Their eyes met briefly, and the warmth that passed between them was quieter than fire, steadier than words. For weeks now, their companionship had grown into something neither had dared to name. It was in the way he placed her cup of tea closer to her hand each morning, the way she mended his shirts with more care than she ever gave her own clothes, the way silence between them no longer felt heavy, but sacred. And yet, beneath that peace, there was an unspoken tension, a sense that the world beyond the cabin walls was waiting to reclaim what little happiness they had built. That afternoon, Thomas hitched his horse and rode into Pine Ridge for supplies. The sky was pale and low, the kind of color that warned of more snow to come. The town looked half asleep under the gray sky, smoke rising from the chimneys in thin, tired ribbons. He had barely tied his horse in front of the general store when he noticed the sheriff's office door open across the street. Sheriff Silas McCrae stepped out, pulling on his gloves. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his hair silvered at the temples, his face lined from years of weighing right against wrong. When he saw Thomas, his expression tightened, not unfriendly, but wary. "Morning, Avery," he said, walking over. "Morning, Sheriff." McCrae's gaze lingered on him a moment too long. "You've been keeping quiet up there. Folks don't see much of you these days." Thomas adjusted the strap on his satchel. "Same as always. Winter keeps a man busy." "That so?" McCrae's voice held the careful weight of someone circling a truth. "I've had men asking after you. Strangers. Said they were looking for a young lady, claimed she was in trouble, needed protection." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You believe them?" "I believe money talks louder than truth," McCrae said, his tone even. "Still, I've got to ask, there's no woman up there with you, is there?" Thomas met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Why would there be?" The sheriff studied him for a long, silent moment. Then he sighed. "Because if there is, and she's who they say she is, it won't end easy. Her family's got reach. The kind of reach that don't stop at the county line." Thomas's voice was calm, but beneath it lay iron. "You came to warn me or to threaten me?" McCrae's grey eyes softened just slightly. "To remind you that I've got a badge, not wings. I can't protect you if you start lying. Then maybe you shouldn't come asking questions you don't want answered." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Avery. Don't let a woman's troubles drag you under." Thomas's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. When the sheriff turned and walked away, the snow began to fall again, thick, steady, and silent. By the time Thomas returned to the cabin, night had already fallen. The window glowed faintly with lamplight, and for a moment he just sat on his horse, watching that warm square of light through the trees. He could see Eleanor moving inside, her silhouette graceful against the fire. The sight filled him with a quiet ache, so much beauty hidden in such a small, fragile piece. When he stepped inside, Eleanor looked up at once, her expression softening with relief. "You're late," she said. "Roads are worse than they look." She set her sewing aside. "Did you hear anything in town?" He hesitated, hanging up his coat. "The sheriff stopped me." Her breath caught. "Did he know?" "No, but he's guessing. And those men, your family's men, they've been talking to him." Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. "Thomas, if he finds out, if they convince him..." He stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. They won't. I gave him nothing to find. Her eyes shone with fear. You can't keep lying for me. I'm not lying, he said softly. I'm protecting what's mine to protect. The words hung between them, heavier than either expected. She blinked, her voice trembling. Yours? He met her gaze, his eyes dark and steady. You're under my roof. That makes your safety my responsibility. Eleanor swallowed hard, but her heart beat faster. There was something in his tone that made her feel both safe and exposed all at once. And when they come with the law, then they'll find the law doesn't live in this cabin, he said quietly. For a moment, neither moved. The fire crackled softly, and the air between them seemed to hum with something too powerful to name. She turned away, pacing toward the window. You don't know what they're capable of, Thomas. They'll ruin you to get to me. They don't forgive disobedience, especially not from a woman. He watched her, his voice roughened with emotion. Then they'll have to ruin me first. She spun toward him, eyes flashing with tears. Don't say that. Why not? He asked, stepping closer. You think I'd stand by while they take you back to the people who broke you? Her breath trembled. You can't fight the whole world. I don't need to, he said, his voice low. I just need to fight the part of it that's standing on my doorstep. Something inside her gave way then, something between fear and longing. She stared at him, her throat tight, her heart warring with reason. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, he said, but it's the only thing that feels right. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows that made his eyes seem darker, more intense. Eleanor felt her composure slipping like ice underfoot. She took a small step toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. Why do you care so much, Thomas? He hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with trembling restraint. Because I can't remember the last time I cared about anything that mattered. Her breath caught. She wanted to look away, but his gaze held her captive. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered. Why? Because I might start believing you mean them. He smiled faintly, his thumb grazing her skin before he let his hand fall. Maybe I do. She turned her face away, her eyes glistening. You don't know me. I know enough, he said softly. Enough to see the truth you hide from yourself. The silence that followed was heavy with all that could not be said. Outside, the wind rose, howling against the cabin walls like a living thing. That night, neither of them slept easily. Eleanor sat by the fire long after Thomas had retreated to his chair near the door. She watched the flames burn low, her thoughts tangled with guilt and longing. The memory of his touch lingered on her cheek like warmth that refused to fade. When she finally spoke, her voice broke the quiet. Thomas? He stirred, but did not open his eyes. Yes? Do you ever wish things were different? He opened his eyes then, the glow from the dying fire reflecting in them. Every day, he said softly. She hesitated. What would you change? He looked at her for a long moment. I'd make sure you never had to run from anything again. Eleanor's breath caught, tears stinging her eyes. That's not something you can promise. He gave a weary, tender smile. No, but I can try. The clock on the shelf ticked softly, counting the seconds between their words. You should sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow will come early. She nodded and rose, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. But as she passed him, she paused, her hand hovering above his arm. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, with a trembling sigh, she rested her hand lightly on his sleeve. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For being the only person who's ever made me feel safe. His voice was barely a murmur. You make it easy to want to try. She drew her hand back slowly and walked to her bed. As she lay down, she could hear the faint creak of his chair as he leaned forward, the sound of his breath steady in the dark. It comforted her more than any lullaby. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in silence. But inside the small cabin, two souls kept watch, the wounded woman who feared she would be found, and the man who had already decided he would not let her go without a fight. The storm that threatened to destroy them had not yet arrived, but its shadow already stretched across the mountains, long and inevitable. And still, in that fragile quiet, love, defiant, unspoken, and trembling, continued to grow between them like a secret flame refusing to die. The snow had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in slow, patient veils, blurring the outline of the mountains and burying the world in silence. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its glow flickering softly against the walls. Eleanor Finch sat at the small wooden table, wrapped in one of Thomas's wool blankets, staring at the letter that lay unopened before her. It had arrived that morning, delivered by a boy from the valley who had braved the cold to bring it up the mountain. He had said little, only that a man in town had paid him handsomely to see it delivered directly to Mrs. Finch. The name had startled her, though she had corrected nothing. There was safety in anonymity. Now, hours later, the letter remained sealed, mocking her with its presence. The paper was thick, the handwriting precise and elegant, unmistakably familiar. Thomas stood by the window, his arms crossed as he watched the snow. "You've been staring at that letter for half the day," he said gently. "You don't have to open it if you don't want to." Eleanor's fingers trembled over the folded paper. "If I don't, I'll never know what they plan. If I do—" She trailed off, her voice fading into the crackle of the fire. He turned toward her, his face softened by the lamplight. "Whatever's in there, it can't change what's here. Not unless you let it." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment her fear loosened. Thomas Avery had a way of making her believe that the world could stop at the edge of these 4 walls, that nothing could reach her here. But she knew better. The past always found its way in. Taking a deep breath, she broke the seal. The sound was small, but it filled the room like a gunshot. Her eyes skimmed the first lines, and her expression changed. Shock first, then anger, then something like heartbreak. She pushed back from the table, rising to her feet. "They dare to write to me as if they love me." Thomas's voice was quiet. "Who?" "My family." Her hands shook as she held the letter out to him. "They say they forgive me, that they're ready to welcome me home, so long as I agree to their conditions." "What kind of conditions?" She laughed bitterly. "The kind that make you a ghost in your own life. They want me to return to the house, hidden away until the child is born. Then they'll take it from me and tell the world it was stillborn. They'll bury a coffin of nothing and call it redemption." Thomas stared at her, his jaw tightening. "And you?" "I'll disappear," she whispered. "They'll send me to some distant relative or a convent, perhaps, somewhere I can be forgotten." He stepped forward, his voice low but fierce. "You won't go back." Her breath hitched. "Thomas?" "No." His tone deepened, unshakable. "You hear me, Eleanor? You won't go back. They had their chance to protect you. They chose shame instead. You owe them nothing." She turned away, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand what they can do. My family's name, its reputation, it's all that matters to them. They'll destroy anyone who stands in their way. Let them try." She faced him then, her voice trembling. "And if they drag you down with me, what then?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Then I'll fall with you," he said softly, "and I won't regret a single thing." The words broke something inside her. She had lived so long guarded, wrapped in layers of obedience and fear, and now, before her, stood a man who saw none of that, only her, the woman she had hidden for years. "Why do you keep fighting for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because someone should," he said. Her lips parted, but no sound came. For a moment, the only noise in the room was the wind outside and the faint crackle of burning wood. She looked up at him, his face roughened by the cold, his eyes steady and kind, and she felt an ache she could no longer ignore. "Thomas," she whispered, "you don't know what you're saying." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were solemn. "I've never been clearer in my life." Eleanor turned back to the letter, the words swimming before her eyes. A second page slipped free, smaller, folded differently, her brow furrowed as she opened it. Inside was another hand, one that made her blood run cold. The ink was darker, the writing sharper. "You are not the first woman he has ruined, nor will you be the last." She dropped the page as though it had burned her. "No," she whispered. Thomas stepped closer. "What is it?" She couldn't speak at first. Then, gathering her breath, she whispered, "It's from him, the man who—" Her voice broke. "The man who fathered this child." Thomas's expression darkened. "He wrote to you?" She nodded, the tears spilling freely now. "He says I've shamed him, that if I speak his name, he'll ruin me publicly. He says no one will believe me, that I'm a liar, a hysteric. He calls me a mistake." Her voice cracked on the word. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "Coward!" She sank into the chair, her body trembling. "He's powerful, Thomas, connected. He'll turn the world against me." Thomas knelt beside her, his voice quiet but burning with conviction. "Let him try. He's already taken enough from you. He doesn't get to take your peace too." She looked at him through tears. "You don't know what it's like to be powerless." He met her gaze. "Don't I?" His voice softened. "I know what it's like to lose everything that made you feel alive. I know what it means to wake up and wonder why you still breathe, but I also know what it means to find a reason to start again." Her breath hitched. "And what reason is that?" "You," he said simply. Her eyes widened, her heart pounding. The air seemed to vanish between them. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a tear from her cheek with the back of his fingers. "You think you're broken, Eleanor," he whispered, "but you're the strongest person I've ever met." She closed her eyes, the tears falling faster. "Don't say things you can't mean. I mean every word." Her voice was barely a breath. "And if I fall apart?" He leaned closer, his voice deep and tender. "Then I'll be there to help you gather the pieces." For a long moment, neither moved. The lamplight flickered across their faces, and the air between them grew heavy, with something fragile and unspoken. She wanted to tell him how much his kindness terrified her, how love had always been a weapon in her world, but all she could do was look at him, and in that look, everything was said. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft but steady. "You don't know the kind of men we're dealing with." "Then tell me," he said. "Let me understand." She shook her head. "If I tell you, it'll change everything." He took her hand, his rough palm warm against her trembling fingers. "Then let it change everything." Her throat tightened. "The man who fathered my child, he's married. A friend of my family, older, respected. When he found out I was with child, he offered me money to disappear. My parents called it mercy. When I refused, they planned to lock me away until the birth, to send me off under another name." Thomas's jaw hardened. "And when you ran, they sent men after me, Hartwell Sloane and Edmund Rourke. They work for him, not for my parents. They're paid to keep me silent." Thomas exhaled slowly, trying to contain the rage that rose inside him. "Then you did the right thing leaving." Her eyes glistened with exhaustion. "It doesn't feel like it." He squeezed her hand gently. "That's because doing the right thing never feels easy." For the rest of the evening they sat in silence, the letter still open on the table between them. The snow outside had grown heavier, but inside the cabin the air was thick with something else. Truth, finally spoken, and the quiet bond of shared vulnerability. When Eleanor finally rose to go to bed, she stopped by the hearth. "Thomas," she said softly, turning toward him, "you've given me something I never thought I'd have again." "What's that?" "Someone who listens without judging." He smiled faintly. "You make it easy to listen." Her voice trembled as she whispered, "You make it hard not to feel." For a heartbeat, the space between them closed. The air was electric, their gazes locked in a moment that balanced between restraint and surrender. Thomas's hand rose instinctively, hovering near her face, then stopped short. She looked at him, her breath unsteady. "Thomas," he withdrew his hand slowly. "You should rest," he said, his voice low. She nodded, though her eyes lingered on his, longer than they should have. Good night. Good night, Eleanor. When she disappeared behind the curtain, Thomas turned back to the letter on the table. He stared at it for a long time, the ink catching the light. He wanted to burn it to erase every word that had hurt her, but he didn't. Instead, he folded it carefully and tucked it into the Bible she had used to teach him. As the fire dwindled and the snow whispered against the windows, Thomas sat alone in the quiet. The letter had changed everything. It had confirmed what he already knew. The world beyond their mountain would never forgive Eleanor Finch. But as he listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing in the next room, Thomas Avery made a silent vow. The world would have to go through him first. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered in the pale, heavy sky. The world outside the cabin lay buried beneath a thick quilt of snow, untouched and gleaming beneath the weak afternoon sun. The air was sharp, the kind that made every breath visible, and yet inside the small cabin, warmth clung stubbornly to the walls, along with the silence that had followed Eleanor's confession. Thomas Avery stood near the hearth, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate movements, though his mind was far from the task. Every word she had spoken the night before echoed through him like a refrain he could not silence. The man who had ruined her, the family who had abandoned her, the child who would soon come into the world without a name, each truth had carved itself deep into him. Eleanor sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, her hands resting on her belly. She looked fragile, but there was a quiet strength about her now, a calmness born not from peace, but from resignation. The morning light fell across her face, softening the hollows beneath her eyes. She noticed him watching and offered a faint, weary smile. "You haven't said a word since last night," she murmured. Thomas lowered the knife and set it on the table. "Words don't come easy when there's too much to feel." Her gaze dropped to her hands. "You shouldn't carry my burdens. I've brought enough trouble into your home." He took a slow step toward her. "You didn't bring trouble, Eleanor. Trouble found you. And if it's found you, it's found me too." Her eyes glistened, though she tried to look away. "You make it sound noble. It isn't. You could lose everything because of me." "I already lost everything once," he said quietly. "This," he gestured to the cabin, the fire, the snow outside, "this isn't living. It's surviving. You gave it meaning again." Her throat tightened. "Don't say that." "It's the truth." The silence that followed was thick with feeling. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the fire. "When you speak like that, it frightens me," she said softly, "because I start to believe you mean it." Thomas's voice was low, steady, filled with that quiet tenderness that had undone her since the first day. "I've never said anything I didn't mean." She turned, her eyes full of emotion. "You don't understand. Where I come from, men use words like promises, and promises like weapons." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even before he spoke. "Then let me show you what it means when a man keeps one." Her breath caught. "And what promise is that?" "That I'll protect you," he said simply. "Whatever comes." Eleanor's heart swelled painfully in her chest. "You can't protect me from the world, Thomas." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can stand between you and the worst of it." The firelight flickered over their faces, the air between them thick with the weight of everything unsaid. She wanted to tell him how much his presence had come to mean, how the sound of his voice had become her anchor in a sea of fear. But her courage failed her. Instead, she looked away, blinking back tears. He noticed and reached out gently, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand. "You don't have to hide that from me," he whispered. Her voice trembled. "I've spent my life hiding. I don't know how to stop." "Then let me teach you," he said, his tone almost a plea. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. His hand lingered near her face, his fingers barely grazing her skin. The contact was light, innocent even, but it sent a tremor through both of them, the kind that comes when silence turns into something dangerous and sacred. Eleanor stepped back, her voice unsteady. "If you keep saying things like that, I'll forget to be afraid." He smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. For a moment she almost smiled too, but the sound of hoofbeats shattered the fragile peace. Thomas's expression darkened. He strode to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Two riders approached through the snow, their figures distant but unmistakable. He recognized the sharp posture of men who came with purpose. Eleanor's face drained of color. "It's them," she whispered. "I know it." "Stay here," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, don't open that door." "Thomas, no!" He turned to her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Eleanor, I need you to trust me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I do. That's what frightens me most." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but time had run out. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside into the cold. The wind bit at his face as he crossed the clearing. The riders dismounted, their horses snorting clouds of steam into the frigid air. Hartwell Sloane led, his expression as smooth and smug as ever, his gloved hands clasped neatly before him. Beside him, Edmund Rourke adjusted his coat and looked toward the cabin. "Afternoon, Mr. Avery," Hartwell said, his voice falsely pleasant. "I hope we're not disturbing your peace." "You are," Thomas said flatly. "State your business." Hartwell's smile widened. "We've brought the sheriff. Thought it best to keep things proper this time." Thomas's stomach dropped. From behind the riders, Sheriff McCrae appeared, mounted and grim. His badge caught the faint light of the dying sun. "Thomas," the sheriff called, his tone heavy. "We need to talk." Hartwell stepped forward. "We have reason to believe Miss Eleanor Finch is residing here, under your protection. The law requires she be returned to her family's custody." Thomas's voice was calm, but lethal. "She's not a piece of stolen property. She's a fugitive," Hartwell countered. "A woman carrying a scandal that will ruin more than her own name if left unchecked. You're harboring her, Avery. That's a crime." McCrae dismounted, his expression torn. "Thomas, tell me the truth. Is she here?" Thomas met his eyes. "If she were, I wouldn't tell you." The sheriff sighed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Hartwell smirked. "We can do this easy, or we can do it the hard way." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You've already chosen the hard way by coming here." Rourke moved toward the cabin, but Thomas raised his rifle. "Take another step and you'll regret it." The tension crackled like ice about to break. The sheriff raised a hand. "Enough. Nobody's dying today." Hartwell's tone turned cold. "He's obstructing the law." "The law doesn't belong to men like you," Thomas shot back. From inside the cabin, the door creaked open. Eleanor stepped out, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her face was pale but resolute. "Stop this," she said. "Please!" Thomas turned sharply. "Eleanor," she shook her head. "You can't fight them for me. Not like this." Hartwell's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Wise decision, Miss Finch. Let's go home." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But I won't let another man suffer because of me." Thomas lowered his rifle slowly, his heart pounding. "Eleanor, you don't owe them anything." She turned to him, her eyes full of sorrow. "I owe you more than you know." The sheriff stepped forward cautiously. "Miss Finch, I can take you into protective custody. No one will harm you, but you have to come willingly." Eleanor looked between the men, the sheriff's weary honesty, Hartwell's poisonous calm, and Thomas's fierce, unspoken love. Then she took a deep breath. "If I go, will you leave him out of this?" Hartwell nodded, his smile returning. "Of course, you have my word." Thomas's voice was sharp. "His word isn't worth the ink it's written with." "Please," she whispered, "don't make this worse." He wanted to grab her hand, to pull her back inside and lock the world away, but one look at her face told him it was too late. She had made up her mind. Eleanor stepped toward the sheriff. "I'll go peacefully, but not for them. For him." Thomas's throat tightened. "Eleanor," she turned back to him, her eyes shining with tears. "You once said you'd stand between me and the worst of the world. You already have. Now let me stand between you and the rest of it." Before he could answer, she pressed her hand to his chest, light, trembling, and full of everything she couldn't say aloud. Then she let it fall and faced the men waiting for her. As the sheriff helped her mount one of the horses, Hartwell tipped his hat mockingly toward Thomas. "You see, Avery, everything finds its way home eventually." Thomas said nothing. His hands curled into fists, his jaw set. He stood in silence as the riders disappeared down the trail, Eleanor's figure small against the white expanse of snow. When they vanished from sight, he turned back toward the cabin. The fire still burned inside, its light flickering against the window. But the warmth was gone, and the quiet that filled the room was no longer peace. It was absence, sharp, hollow, and absolute. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. Then, with a voice that cracked from the weight of it, he whispered to the empty room, "I promised I'd protect you. I didn't promise I'd let you go." Outside, the snow began to fall again, erasing the trail she had left behind, but not the promise he had made to follow it. The wind tore across the mountain like a wounded animal, scattering white dust into the air and shaking the pine trees until they groaned beneath its weight. Thomas Avery rode through it, his coat drawn tight, his breath visible in the freezing air. The trail to Pine Ridge was half buried now, but he followed it by instinct. He could not afford to lose it. The snow fell harder with every mile, yet he pressed on, his heart pounding with one single relentless thought. He had let her go. Not because he wanted to, but because she had asked him to. Because she had looked at him with those tear-filled eyes and whispered words he would never forget. "Let me stand between you and the rest of the world." Now, she was gone, taken down that white path by men who called themselves righteous, escorted by a sheriff who had once been his friend. The memory of it burned in him, sharper than the cold. By the time Thomas reached the edge of town, dusk had fallen. Green Ridge was quiet beneath the storm, the streets lined with snowdrifts and shuttered windows. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his boots sinking deep into the frost. The light from inside flickered against the snow, and he could hear voices, low, cautious, familiar. He pushed the door open without knocking. Sheriff McCrae looked up from behind his desk, startled. Hartwell Sloane stood near the stove, his fine coat still damp from travel, while Edmund Rourke leaned against the wall with his hat in hand. And sitting in the corner, wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale but composed, was Eleanor Finch. Her eyes widened the instant she saw him. "Thomas!" He froze where he stood, his breath ragged. For a long moment no one spoke. The fire popped in the stove, and the wind rattled the door behind him. McCrae rose slowly. "Thomas, this isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't," he said, his voice low but steady. "You took her from my home." Hartwell smiled faintly. "She was never yours to keep." Thomas's gaze cut through him like a blade. "She wasn't yours to own." Eleanor stood, trembling. "Please don't." But Thomas had already crossed the room. He stopped only a few feet from Hartwell, his fists clenched at his sides. "You said you were taking her to her family," he said, "not locking her up like a criminal." Hartwell's tone turned cold. "Miss Finch is here under my protection until her family arrives. The sheriff agreed it was best for all involved." Thomas looked at McCrae, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You agreed to this?" The sheriff sighed, weary. "She's safe here, Thomas. Better than being hunted across the mountains. She was safe with me." "Safe?" Hartwell's laugh was soft and venomous. "A pregnant woman hiding with a widower in a cabin built for ghosts. That's not safety, Avery. That's scandal." Thomas moved forward, and McCrae stepped between them. "Enough," the sheriff barked. "This isn't helping anyone." But Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos, quiet, yet fierce. "Let him speak." Every head turned toward her. She stood tall despite her trembling hands, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "You think locking me in a cell will make the world forget what he did to me?" she asked Hartwell, her voice shaking with emotion. "You think my silence will protect your precious reputation?" Hartwell's smile faltered. "I'm only following orders." "From a coward," she said sharply, "a man too afraid to face the truth of what he's done." Thomas watched her, pride and fear warring within him. There was a strength in her he had always seen, but now it blazed like fire. Hartwell's composure slipped, his jaw tightening. "You've grown bold since you left home." "I've grown tired," she said. "Tired of men like you deciding my worth." McCrae rubbed a hand over his face. "That's enough from everyone. Hartwell, you'll wait outside." Hartwell hesitated, but finally turned toward the door, his coat brushing Thomas's shoulder as he passed. Rourke followed him, muttering under his breath. The sheriff closed the door behind them and turned back to Eleanor and Thomas. "Eleanor," McCrae said gently, "I'm trying to keep the peace here. But these men, your family, they've got influence. If I don't cooperate, they'll send someone worse." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And if I go with them?" He hesitated. "Then they'll call it resolved. The scandal disappears and the town forgets." Thomas's voice was rough with disbelief. "Forget? Forget a woman's life?" McCrae looked down. "Sometimes that's the only kind of justice a place like this allows." Eleanor's lips trembled, but she said nothing. The room fell silent again, heavy with the weight of decisions no one wanted to make. After a long moment, Thomas spoke, his voice low and steady. "If you take her, Sheriff, I'll follow. If they move her, I'll find her. And if they hurt her—" McCrae held up a hand. "Thomas, don't." "I will," Thomas said, his tone unyielding. "I swear it." Eleanor took a step forward. "Thomas, please, don't do this for me." He turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm not doing it for you, Eleanor. I'm doing it because I can't live knowing I let them break you again." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You'll be ruined." "So be it," he said. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The firelight flickered between them, casting their faces in gold and shadow. Finally, McCrae exhaled and set his hat on the table. "All right," he said quietly. "You both need to leave. Tonight." Eleanor blinked. "Leave? I can't hold them off forever. By morning, they'll have orders to take her by force. Go north, through Bitterroot Pass. No one will follow you there." Thomas frowned. "You'd risk your badge for us?" McCrae's smile was faint but sincere. "There's more to law than what's written on paper. Sometimes it's about doing what's right." Eleanor's voice trembled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, glancing toward the door. "They'll be back soon. You've got less than an hour." Thomas turned to Eleanor. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though her fear was visible. "If I have to." He reached for her hand, steadying her. "Then we'll make it." They slipped out into the snow through the back door. The storm had softened, the wind carrying only a whisper now, but the cold cut deep. The moonlight glinted off the snow, illuminating their path like a silver ribbon. Thomas helped her mount his horse and swung up behind her, his arms encircling her protectively. As they rode through the trees, Eleanor leaned against him, her breath mingling with the frost in the air. "Where will we go?" she asked softly. "Some place they won't find us," he murmured. "Farther north, maybe beyond the ridge. And if they do find us—" He tightened his hold around her. "Then they'll learn what it means to fight a man with nothing left to lose." She closed her eyes, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them echoing the beat of her heart. The forest seemed endless, each pine tree like a sentinel watching their flight. The snow sparkled faintly under the moon, a landscape both beautiful and merciless. After a while she spoke again, her voice trembling. "I used to dream about running away. I always thought freedom would feel like flying. But now that it's here, it feels like falling," he finished gently. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against his shoulder. "And you?" "I stopped dreaming a long time ago," he said, "until you walked into my life." Her breath caught. "Thomas." He met her gaze, their faces inches apart, the world around them fading into the whisper of wind and the rhythm of hooves. "Whatever happens after tonight," he said, his voice low and rough, "you have to know you're not alone anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. "You make me believe things I'd forgotten to believe." He smiled faintly. "Then let that be the start." They rode in silence for what felt like hours, the night stretching endlessly before them. When the first faint light of dawn touched the horizon, they stopped by a stream half frozen with ice. Thomas helped her down, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "You should rest," he said softly. She looked up at him, her lips trembling. "And you?" "I'll keep watch." Eleanor hesitated, then reached for his hand. "Thomas, if this is the last quiet moment we ever have, I want you to know something." He looked down at her, his breath visible in the cold. "What's that?" She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me, not just from them, but from myself." He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You didn't need saving, Eleanor. You just needed someone to see you." Their eyes locked, and in that fragile dawn light, the air between them shimmered with all the love they could not yet speak. When the wind rose again, carrying the scent of pine and snow, it felt less like a warning and more like a promise, a reminder that even in a world built on loss, two hearts could still find each other in the silence of the storm. And as Thomas stood watch, the pale sun climbing over the mountains, he whispered into the morning air a vow no one else would ever hear. "I'll keep my promise," he said, "no matter how far we have to run." The dawn that found them was thin and pale, like mercy offered with trembling hands. Frost clung to the branches above the creek, and the ice along the edges held tight, refusing to surrender to the faint light. Thomas stood with his back to the wind, watching the tree line, listening for sounds that did not belong to the mountain. Every breath burned his lungs. Every heartbeat carried one fear and one vow. Behind him, Eleanor sat on a folded blanket near the bank, Thomas's coat wrapped around her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed, despite the cold, and her fingers pressed hard against her belly, as if she could steady what was shifting inside her. When she looked up at him, her eyes were wide, glossy with pain and courage. "It's starting," she whispered. Thomas crossed the short distance in 2 strides, kneeling beside her. "Say it again." Her breath hitched. "The pains. They're closer now." He had imagined this moment in his mind 100 times, but imagination had not prepared him for the sight of her fighting to keep her voice steady, for the way her pride refused to let her collapse, even when her body demanded it. Thomas's hands hovered, uncertain where to place themselves, as if he feared he might break her by touching her. "Eleanor," he said, quiet but urgent, "we need shelter." She nodded once, jaw trembling. "Not far," she managed. I can still move." Thomas scanned the slope beyond the creek, then remembered the old line of trees that curved west, a place where the wind bent differently. He had seen a structure there once, years ago, half swallowed by snow and time, a trapper's lean-to that might still hold. He rose, keeping his voice calm even as panic clawed at him. "Hold on to me," he said. "We'll get you somewhere warm." When Eleanor tried to stand, her knees buckled and her breath turned into a sharp, helpless sound. Thomas caught her instantly, one arm braced around her back, the other steadying her beneath her elbow. Her fingers clutched his sleeve with desperate strength. "I'm sorry," she whispered, like an apology was a habit she could not break. "Don't," he said, his voice thick. "Don't apologize for living." They moved slowly through the snow, Thomas guiding her step by step, his body shielding hers from the wind. At times, she leaned into him, and he felt the tremor in her frame, the heat of her breath against his throat, the way her hair brushed his cheek when she bowed her head. Every small contact made his heart tighten because it was tenderness and terror braided into one. When they reached the lean-to, it was worse than he remembered, but it was shelter. A rough roof of timber, walls half-repaired with old canvas and boards, the floor packed earth beneath a layer of frozen straw. Thomas cleared a space with frantic hands, then built a fire with wood he tore from a fallen branch, coaxing flame from tinder like a prayer he could not afford to whisper. Eleanor lowered herself carefully onto the blanket he spread, her face drawn tight, her lips pale with effort. The air smelled of smoke and damp pine, and the clean, brutal cold seeping in at every crack. Thomas crouched beside her. "Tell me what to do." Eleanor's laugh was a broken sound. "As if I know." He swallowed hard, eyes shining. "Then tell me what you need." Her gaze held his, and something in it softened, even through pain. "Stay," she whispered. "Don't leave me." He took her hand, pressing it against his chest so she could feel the pounding there. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of breath and firelight and whispered words. Eleanor's pain rose and fell like waves, each one stronger than the last. Thomas kept the fire alive, kept her warm, kept his voice steady. He wiped her brow with the edge of his shirt, fed her small sips of water from his tin cup, and spoke to her as if his words could anchor her to this world. "You're doing it," he murmured over and over. "You're stronger than the storm. You're stronger than all of them." At times she gripped his hand so tightly he thought he might lose feeling in his fingers, but he welcomed the ache. It meant she was still here. It meant she was not alone. And then, in a moment that felt both endless and sudden, Eleanor's body tensed with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. She cried out, raw and fierce, and Thomas leaned close, forehead nearly touching hers. "Look at me," he said. "Look at me, Eleanor." Her eyes found his, wild with fear and determination. "You're not a mistake," he whispered, voice breaking. "Not you, not this child, not any of it." A sob tore from her, and with it came a strength that seemed to rise from somewhere beyond pain. She pushed, trembling, breath shattering into the cold air, and Thomas held her as if holding her could keep her safe from everything he could not fight. When the baby's first cry cut through the lean-to, sharp and living, Thomas froze. For a second he could only stare, stunned by the sound, by the proof. Eleanor collapsed back, shaking, tears streaming down her face as she laughed and sobbed at once. "He's alive," she whispered, almost disbelieving. Thomas's hands moved before his mind caught up, guided by instinct and desperate reverence. He wrapped the infant in the cleanest cloth he had, his own shirt sacrificed without hesitation, and placed the tiny, warm weight against Eleanor's chest. The baby's face was red and furious at the world, his fists clenched, like he had already decided he would not be conquered. Eleanor's arms closed around him with a tenderness so fierce it looked like defiance. Thomas looked at them, his vision blurring, and something inside him that had been locked for years broke open. "You did it," he whispered, voice ragged. "You did it." Eleanor lifted her gaze to his, tears clinging to her lashes. "I couldn't have," she breathed. "Not without you." He shook his head, swallowing the ache in his throat. "You would have, you always would have, but I'm grateful you didn't have to." Outside, the wind shifted. A faint sound carried through the trees, distant but unmistakable. Hooves. Thomas's head snapped up. His entire body went still, every muscle taut. Eleanor sensed it and clutched the baby closer, fear flashing in her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered. He rose, moving to the edge of the lean-to, rifle in hand, breath held. Two figures appeared through the snow, slow and cautious, one leading a horse with a bundled shape strapped behind the saddle. Sheriff McCrae raised a hand, palm out, the gesture of a man who came without violence. "I'm alone," he called, "and I brought help." Thomas didn't lower the rifle. "You have a strange way of helping." McCrae's shoulders sagged. He stepped closer, and in the weak light, Thomas saw the fatigue in his face, the kind that came from carrying a choice that could ruin him. "I sent them the wrong direction," the sheriff said quietly. "It'll buy you some hours, maybe a day." The bundled shape behind his saddle moved, then a familiar woman's voice floated out, breathless and steady. "Thomas Avery, if you shoot that sheriff, I'll never forgive you." Thomas blinked, stunned, as Agnes Weller slid down from the horse with the stiff grace of an older woman who had delivered half the town's babies and feared nothing living. Agnes's eyes swept Thomas, then the lean-to, then Eleanor within, and her expression softened without losing its sharpness. "Let me see her." Thomas stepped aside, still watching the tree line, but Agnes pushed past him with purpose. McCrae followed, removing his hat as if the space required respect. When Agnes reached Eleanor, she crouched instantly, checking the baby with quick, expert hands. Then Eleanor's face, her breathing, the way she held herself. "Well," Agnes said finally, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, "you brought him into this world with fire in your spine. Good. You'll need it." Eleanor's voice trembled. "They'll come." Agnes glanced at McCrae. "Then we won't sit here waiting." McCrae cleared his throat. "There's a way to end this. Not by running forever, by making it too dangerous for those men to keep chasing you." Thomas's jaw clenched. "How?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to Eleanor. "By speaking the truth where everyone can hear it, and by putting proof in the hands of people who can't pretend they never saw it." Eleanor's face tightened. "If I say his name, he'll destroy me." Thomas moved closer, his voice low. "He's already tried." Her eyes lifted to his, searching. He reached down, careful and gentle, and brushed his knuckles across her cheek, a touch so tender it felt like a vow. "You don't have to do it alone," he murmured. "If you speak, I'll be there. If they try to shame you, I'll stand beside you until shame has nowhere left to land." Agnes snorted softly. "That's a fine speech. Now give her something useful." Thomas blinked, then reached into his satchel with shaking hands. He pulled out the Bible, the worn leather dark with use, and from inside it the folded pages he had saved. Eleanor stared at it as if it were both weapon and wound. McCrae's eyes narrowed. "That's the letter." Thomas nodded. "And this." He reached again, drawing out Eleanor's locket, the one she had clutched in her sleep, the one she had never let out of her sight. He placed it gently in her palm. Her fingers curled around it, trembling. Agnes wrapped the baby tighter, then fixed Eleanor with a stare that had steadied women through every kind of agony. "Listen to me. You can spend your life running, or you can plant your feet and make them back away. Either choice costs you something, but only one gives your child a future." Eleanor's breath shook. She looked down at the baby, then up at Thomas. The firelight caught his eyes, and she saw what she had tried not to see for weeks, the love there, quiet and fierce and honorable. "All right," she whispered. "All right." They moved fast. Agnes insisted Eleanor ride, cradling the baby against her chest beneath Thomas's coat. Thomas walked beside the horse at first, then mounted behind her when the path narrowed and the cold grew crueler. McCrae led them through a back approach into town, avoiding the main road, avoiding eyes that would ask questions too soon. By the time they reached Pine Ridge, the sky had turned the color of steel. The town looked like a painting carved in ice, quiet on the surface, busy with whispers beneath. McCrae brought them not to the jail, but to the church hall beside it, where a handful of townspeople had gathered, summoned by the sheriff with a voice that did not invite refusal. Thomas helped Eleanor down, his hands steady, his eyes never leaving her face. She swayed, exhausted, but she did not fall. When he offered his arm, she took it, and the simple act of leaning on him felt like a declaration. Inside, Hartwell Sloane stood near the front, impatience written in every line of his posture. Edmund Rourke lingered in the back, watchful. When Hartwell saw Eleanor, his smile sharpened. "There you are," he said, loud enough for the room. "This is over." Eleanor stepped forward, the baby cradled against her, her chin lifted. Her voice shook at first, then steadied like a flame finding air. "No," she said. "Now it begins." Hartwell's eyes flicked to the child, then back to her face, and something cold passed through his expression. "You think you've won. You've only made yourself harder to hide." "I'm not hiding," Eleanor said. "Not anymore." She opened the letter with trembling hands. The paper rustled in the hush, and every sound seemed to sharpen. "My family demanded I return so they could take my child," she said, voice carrying through the room. "They planned to claim he was dead, to bury a lie and call it honor." Murmurs rose like wind through dry grass. Hartwell took a step forward. "This is private." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "My life was never private when you decided it belonged to someone else." Thomas stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, close enough that she could feel his steadiness like a wall behind her. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence said what words could not, that she would not be torn away again. Eleanor lifted the smaller note, the one that had burned her fingers when she first read it. Her voice did not falter now. "The father of this child wrote to threaten me, to silence me," she said. "He called me a mistake. He said no one would believe me." Hartwell's mouth tightened. "Do not." Eleanor turned her head slightly, and when she spoke the name, it landed like thunder in the room. Judge Malcolm Ashford. The reaction was immediate, sharp and real. Some gasped. Someone muttered a curse. The judge's name carried weight, the kind that pressed people into obedience. Hartwell's face went still, the mask slipping. Eleanor's hand tightened around the locket. "I have proof," she said, and opened it, showing what was inside, what she had protected with her life. "And I have these letters, and I have a sheriff and a midwife who can swear this child was born alive, here, in this town's reach, not buried by lies." Agnes stepped forward then, chin high. "I will swear it, before God and before any court that dares ask." McCrae's voice followed, steady and clear. "And I will testify that these men threatened and pursued her under paid instruction, not lawful duty." Hartwell's eyes darted, calculating. "You're all making a mistake." Thomas finally spoke, his voice low but carrying, the sound of a man who had spent too long silent and would not be silent again. "The only mistake was thinking she'd stay quiet forever," he said. Then he turned to Eleanor, and the room seemed to vanish for a moment, leaving only the two of them in the glow of something raw and true. "You were never a mistake." Eleanor's breath caught, tears bright in her eyes, but she did not look away. Hartwell backed up slowly, realizing the tide had turned, that the town's gaze had shifted from judgment to outrage. "This isn't finished," he snapped. McCrae stepped forward, hand resting near his belt. "It is for you. Get out of my town." Rourke muttered something under his breath, but he followed Hartwell as they left, their fine coats suddenly looking less like power and more like costume. When the door shut behind them, silence held the room, trembling, as if everyone waited to see what would happen next. Eleanor swayed slightly, fatigue finally catching her, and Thomas steadied her with one hand at her elbow. His touch was gentle, reverent. "You did it," he whispered. Her lips trembled into the smallest smile. "We did." Thomas looked at the baby, then back at her, and something in his expression softened into certainty. He reached into his pocket and drew out a simple ring, worn, polished by years of being held and hidden. He did not speak of the past it carried. He only held it out, offering it like a future. "Eleanor," he said, voice rough, "I can't give you a world that won't judge. I can't promise you easy days, but I can give you a home that won't turn you away, a name that won't be taken from you, a man who will stand beside you in daylight and in storm." Her eyes filled, and she clutched the baby closer, as if she needed both hands to keep from falling apart. "If you'll have me," Thomas continued, quieter now, "then let me be your husband. Let me be his father. Let me spend the rest of my life proving my love is not a weapon." Eleanor stared at him, and in her gaze was every bruise the world had left on her, and every fragile, radiant hope he had helped her find. "Yes," she whispered. Then stronger, with a tremor that sounded like victory, "Yes, Thomas, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook, and when he looked up, his eyes were bright with something he had not allowed himself in years. Then he leaned in, slow and careful, as if asking permission with every inch. Eleanor lifted her face, and their lips met in a kiss that carried no urgency, only devotion, a promise sealed in warmth and restraint. The room exhaled around them, some with tears, some with quiet smiles, as if even the town itself needed this ending to believe in. Thomas drew back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. "You're safe," he whispered. Eleanor's voice was soft, shaking with emotion. "Not because the world became kind, because we became brave," he murmured. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the church hall, A different kind of weather had changed. It was the sound of truth spoken aloud, and love standing in its full height, refusing to bow. And when Eleanor looked down at her child, then back at Thomas, her smile was small but undeniable. "We'll choose his name together," she said. Thomas nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles where the ring rested, a touch as gentle as a vow. "Together," he repeated. "Always." 10 years had passed since the snowstorm that changed everything, and yet the mountains still stood the same, majestic, solemn, and faithful witnesses to the secrets of the valley below. The winters were gentler now, or perhaps time had softened the way Thomas and Eleanor remembered them. The world had moved on, as it always does, but the cabin on the ridge remained, rebuilt and bright, its chimney always sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the clear Montana sky. Thomas Avery sat on the porch, the weight of age visible only in the silver that now threaded through his hair. His hands, though still strong, carried the calm of a man who no longer fought ghosts. The rifle that had once guarded his solitude rested against the wall, unused for years. Instead, a half-carved toy horse sat in his lap, the scent of pine curling in the afternoon air. From inside the cabin came the sound of laughter, high, wild, and full of life. It was the kind of laughter that belonged to children who had never known fear. A girl of 8, with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, burst through the door, her braids swinging as she ran to him. "Papa! Mama says you promised to finish my horse before supper." Thomas smiled, setting down the carving knife. Did she now? Behind her, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, a shawl draped around her shoulders, despite the warmth of spring. Time had changed her too, her face gentler now, her eyes no longer shadowed by the past. There were faint lines at their corners, carved not by sorrow, but by laughter, by 10 years of sunlight and forgiveness. "I said no such thing," she teased, though the warmth in her voice betrayed her. "But if you make him wait any longer, he'll start carving the dinner table instead." Thomas chuckled, motioning for their daughter to sit beside him. "You're as bossy as your mother," he murmured, and the girl grinned, proud of the comparison. Inside, a boy's voice called out, "Mama, Eli took my book again." "Then you must learn to hide it better," Eleanor replied, her tone patient but amused. Thomas shook his head fondly. "Between the two of them, there's no peace for a man who wants a quiet evening." Eleanor leaned against the porch post, her gaze drifting toward the valley below. The settlement had grown since those dark days, a new schoolhouse, a proper church, even a telegraph line that reached the next town. Pine Ridge had become something better than it once was, shaped by the quiet courage of those who refused to let cruelty define them. And yet, even as life had changed, some stories had not been forgotten. Judge Malcolm Ashford had lost everything in the years that followed Eleanor's testimony. His name, once spoken with reverence, had become a whisper of shame. His estates were sold to pay his debts, his influence stripped by the same society he had once manipulated. No one had seen him in years. Rumor said he lived out his days in some distant city, alone. Hartwell Sloane had fared little better. His arrogance had cost him his fortune, his family, and finally his reputation, when the truth of his part in the scandal came to light. It was said that he drank himself into ruin and died muttering Eleanor's name, as if it were the curse that undid him. Eleanor never rejoiced in their downfall. She had learned long ago that vengeance was a poor substitute for peace. Her victory had not been in their punishment, but in her freedom, her right to live without fear, to raise her children under the open sky. "Do you ever think about them?" Thomas asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Sometimes," she said, "not with anger anymore. Just gratitude that we survived what they couldn't." He reached for her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing. Their fingers intertwined easily, the simple touch carrying the weight of a decade of shared life, of nights spent watching storms pass, of children born and lost teeth and seasons that had come and gone like old friends. "I still remember that night," he said softly. The snow, the fire, the sound of you crying his first cry. It doesn't feel like 10 years. Eleanor's smile was tender. That was the night everything began, for both of us. He looked at her then, really looked, and felt the same quiet awe that had struck him the first time she had stepped into his cabin, half frozen, terrified, and yet full of a strength that defied every cruelty the world had dealt her. "I didn't know love could last this long," he murmured. She brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "It lasts because we remember why it had to." Their daughter giggled beside them, holding up the unfinished wooden horse. "You forgot his tail!" Thomas laughed and took the carving back. "You're right, little one. Can't have a horse without a tail." As he worked, the sun began to dip behind the ridge, painting the snowcaps gold. The evening light spilled through the trees, soft and warm, and for a moment everything seemed suspended in that golden stillness, the laughter of children, the whisper of wind through pine, the heartbeat of a home built on redemption. Inside, Eleanor set the table, humming softly. Her voice carried through the open window, the same melody she had sung years ago when she first dared to sing again. It was a lullaby now, one her children knew by heart. When she called them to supper, Thomas lifted their daughter into his arms and turned toward the doorway. He paused, looking back once at the horizon. It was strange, he thought, how a life could turn full circle. The same mountains that had once kept him prisoner had become their refuge. The same silence that had once haunted him was now filled with laughter and warmth. And when he entered the cabin, he realized what he had always known. Home was not the walls that kept the cold away. It was the voice that called your name when the day was done. Eleanor looked up as he stepped inside, her face glowing in the lamplight. "Come," she said softly. "The stew's getting cold." He smiled, brushing a kiss against her temple. "You always say that. And you always take too long to listen." The children burst into laughter, the sound bright and familiar. Thomas sat down at the table, the warmth of the fire and the smell of bread wrapping around him like a blessing. When they joined hands to say grace, Eleanor's voice led them calm and sure. "For what we've lost," she said, "and for what we've found again, we give thanks." Thomas opened his eyes before the others, looking at her as she spoke, and knew that every struggle, every loss, every night spent fearing the world had led to this single, perfect peace. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, shimmering over the snow-covered peaks. The wind quieted, and the cabin stood like a lantern in the dark, a small, enduring light against the endless winter. And in that quiet, Thomas and Eleanor's laughter mingled with their children's, rising into the night like a promise kept, proof that love, when it is born in hardship and tended with grace, can outlast even the coldest storm. Some stories stay with us long after the last word is spoken. Eleanor and Thomas's journey wasn't just about surviving injustice. It was about choosing love when the world offered none, about rebuilding life from the ashes of silence and shame. Their courage reminds us that redemption is never too late, that the heart, no matter how scarred, can still find its way back to the light. Through snow and solitude, they taught us that real love isn't born in comfort. It's forged in the storm. It's the quiet strength that holds another's trembling hand, the promise whispered when all else falls apart. You are not alone. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the chill of the mountain winds or the warmth of their fire, tell me in the comments what you felt most. And to know who journeyed with us all the way to the end, write the word storm below. It's the perfect symbol of what they endured and overcame together. If you'd like to help us continue bringing more stories like this one to life, you can send a small super thanks on YouTube, whatever amount feels right to you. Every gesture of support helps us keep creating, narrating, and sharing these tales that celebrate love's resilience. And if you can't contribute that way, there's another beautiful gift you can give. Share this story with someone who believes, like Eleanor and Thomas, that even the coldest winter can give way to spring. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for keeping romance alive in your heart. Don't miss the other historical love stories waiting for you in the cards at the end of this video. Each one carries its own storm and its own sunrise.